Hey guys, I have a fun little video idea for you today. As GBG has been out for a couple of weeks already, we are trying to get a good idea of how good all the nodons are and how they all work. So today we're going to put them in a tier list. The tiers are going to be based on how generally usable something is. So if something isn't that fancy, but you use it all the time, that's going to give it a very high tier placement. Second is that within the tiers, there's not really going to be a difference. So here, if I put a constant nodon and a button nodon next to each other, I'm not saying that a constant nodon is any more or less valuable than a button nodon. They are both just considered to be part of C tier. So whether it's button then constant or constant then button, it doesn't mean anything. Rule 3 is that all tier placements are basically plus or minus a tier. If we're arguing about B tier versus D tier, like, okay, well that's substantial. But just plus or minus one tier doesn't really matter. With this tier list, F tier is going to be special in that I'm only really going to put nodons in F tier if they are nodons that I'm going to tell you not to use. Lastly, you'll see that above S tier, there's a super special priceless tier. And that doesn't mean that it's better than everything else. It just means that these are nodons that you can't really put a value on, where like, you can't really say like, oh, well, how valuable is it really? It's where that question kind of breaks down and doesn't make any sense. You'll see how I use that shortly, but let's get started. First, constant nodon. Constant nodon, easy S tier. You use them all the time. If you're not using constant nodon, what's wrong with you? Constant nodon lets you set up constants for comparison, for counters, for angles, for all sorts of things. The fact that you use him in basically every level very frequently makes him easy S tier. Button nodon. I'm going to say that of all the control schemes, button is probably the most important. Like, it's really hard to build a level that does not use a button nodon somewhere in it. So I'm going to go ahead and say S tier. Control stick isn't absolutely necessary. There's like a lot of other alternatives, but he's pretty good. He's like pretty generically usable in almost every level that you'll do because the alternatives are tilt controls. If touched, well, he's really useful whenever you want to use touch controls, but you don't really want to use touch controls that frequently. When you set if touched this nodon, you can basically just set up touch controls on like one specific spot and level. So I'm leaning on like low C tier, maybe high D tier. I may change my mind on him later. Touch position nodon is an easy D tier. Like, you don't use touch controls very frequently, but different from if touch nodon, it takes a lot of effort to really program the touch position very well. You can use them. You can get value out of them if you put in the effort. So because of that extra effort that you have to go through, I'm going to put him in D tier. Next we have tilt and motion controls. The main way I describe it is that tilt is the equivalent of a control stick. It's less useful than a control stick, so I'm going to put him at tier B, just because just less handy in general. If face up is like tilt, but because you can't detect between tilting up or tilting down, I'm going to put him in C tier. Shake is kind of like a button press, but for tilt controls, so I'm going to put him in C tier because he's not that handy. And rotation speed also similarly. It's also like a button press, except detecting a rotation speed is actually a little bit harder to do well. And so because of that extra obstacle in setting him up well, I'm going to put him in D tier. IR motion camera. He's good at detecting absolute distances, but that's kind of rare. So I'll put him into C tier. Low C tier, maybe. I'm between putting him in C and D tier, just because it's kind of harder to use him effectively. But IR motion control is like the only way to measure absolute distances. I'm going to skip forward to IR emitter just because they're related to each other, and IR emitter is absolutely terrible. Easy F tier. IR emitter forces you to use two pairs of Joy-Cons, because you need one Joy-Con to emit the IR light for the IR emitter, and he won't do anything unless you have a separate red Joy-Con, right Joy-Con, that has an IR motion camera on it active in order to detect. Once you go through all those obstacles, it's a lot harder to kind of like detect accurately where your position is relative and give accurate feedback to the player so they can understand what's going on. Because of all of these, I'm going to say IR emitter is like just terrible. This is most of the control scheme nodons. So I'm going to move up the hand nodon because he's also effectively a control scheme. I'm going to put hand nodon in B tier because he's very handy for making like puzzles, or when you just want to move things around. It's actually like really nice to just have a kind of a pointer to move things around without jumping through all the hoops necessary with touch controls in order to define all the touching events, etc. A hand nodon just lets you kind of like make it happen. Hand nodon also lets you make weapons and shields or guns or whatever you might want to have on your character. Object break nodon. Object break is probably in solid B tier because it's very useful to just kind of like detect anything breaking your level. But the more fancy you try to be, the more specific detection you'll need in a level. So object break is like really good for, did your player break? Did your player die? Or how many bad guys did you kill to like rack up a score? Or like a checkpoint system or whatever. And that's very generically useful. While object break is pretty handy, I'm kind of like teetering between A and B tier, but I'm feeling more like B tier because we have a lot of other good sensors to work with. On start Nodon, I mean, he's good if you want to do something on start, what can you say? And I would say like C tier is as frequently as you'd want to use on start. He's useful for like a lot of checkpoint systems and stuff like that, but he's not something that you really use in every single level. And when you do use him, you only really use him once, maybe twice. Calculator Nodon. Well, if I were to split Calculator Nodon into the different arithmetic operations, I would put plus sign would probably be around D or F tier because you don't really need an addition when the game kind of already does that when you put things to a port. Subtraction is similarly kind of like more useful, like maybe somewhere between B and C tier. Similarly, you can kind of do that with inversion Nodon. Division is kind of helpful, but not that handy. But just because of the multiplication feature, easy A tier. Because you multiply numbers all the time. This includes multiplying by a constant, or just for vector math, or even as like an if statement to do like logic or related things. Like a calculator Nodon with multiplication is just like extremely powerful. So easy A tier. So map Nodon, this is gonna be tough. I'm gonna say S tier just because I spam him all the time, like to multiply by a constant, to do all sorts of operations, to get your inputs into your outputs. He basically like meshes together different nodons very, very effectively. And for that, like, easy S tier. Digitize. So digitize is really useful for making grids and sometimes for rounding numbers. So like if you need to floor something or related, but it turns out that in GBG, floor and rounding aren't that useful, and he gets the most value when you're working on a grid system. So something like a Minecraft grid or like a Minesweeper grid, and you don't really see a whole lot of those levels. So I'm going to put him into C tier just because the use case isn't that common. Square root Nodon. You basically only use square root when you're doing vector math to determine distances or the absolute like total speed of something or related. I don't really use square root for anything else. And even in those cases, I use it for like AI in a couple of like really advanced situations only a few times. And once for a quadratic equation, that's not super common. I'm gonna put it in C tier just because he really helps with movement. Absolute value Nodon. Probably slightly more useful than square root Nodon, but not by that much. It's actually not super useful to be able to take an absolute value in this game. He has good value, it just doesn't come up super frequently. Inversion Nodon. So he is probably a B tier because there's a lot of times where you have a signal that's just going backwards, and a map Nodon can do that job, but sometimes you just need an inversion Nodon because all you need to do is flip it, and it's more obvious when you see an inversion Nodon than when you see a map Nodon. Just by how frequently that operation needs to happen, B tier. Trigger from Zero. Trigger from Zero is an easy S tier if you are really new at the game. And when you start really coding with him, you quickly realize you don't want to use him at all. You see Trigger from Zero a lot with events where you have like, you're trying to store a variable in a counter or do like some weird looping code that GBG isn't really designed to do. And a lot of those sorts of setups are actually a lot cleaner and more straightforward and cheaper if you find the right setup that does not use Trigger from Zero. There are many times when Trigger from Zero is in fact very useful, but actually he's really uncommon, so I'm just gonna put him in D tier. And yes, like, he is fighting with square root Nodon. I use square root Nodon more than I use Trigger from Zero. Next we have the angle Nodons. Let's start with the easiest one, which is angle to position. Angle to position is pretty useful for defining circular orbits or any sort of circular motion because he directly gives you a sinusoid like sine and cosine. He's also really useful when you want to move an enemy like back and forth in a straight line, but you don't want like a jerky movement where the enemy just kind of like snaps back at the edges. The sinusoid lets you make that movement kind of smooth. And so the angle to position Nodon is actually super handy for this. Position to angle Nodon is not as good. Position to angle Nodon is mostly when you need to convert a vector to an angle. There are two very common situations where you want to use position to angle Nodon. One is when you have a control stick input and you want that to be turned into an angle. This lets you like shoot a gun in a certain direction or whatever. The second use case is when you're doing vector math, where you have an object at point A and you need it to face like the enemy or the player, and the player is at point B. You have the vector that goes from A to B, but now you need an angle so you can feed a hinge to make it face the right direction. That happens, just not like in everything, so I'm going to put him in C tier. Angle difference Nodon is definitely in C tier. You might wonder, you don't really need to take angle differences that frequently. Why is he in C tier? I know you guys are probably going to say, oh, probably D tier. Well, sometimes you do need to take angle differences, and that's like, I've used him a couple of times for that. But the number one thing is that he enables modulo operations, and modulo operations are actually substantially more useful than angle difference operations. Basically, his use in modulo operations is good enough to kind of carry him up to C tier. Comparison Nodon, B tier. Sometimes you just need to compare two numbers and see which one's bigger or equal. I don't think I really need to defend this one. And Nodon, well, as far as logic goes, he is very useful. People definitely overuse the AND Nodon, but he's definitely fantastic. The main issue you have with AND Nodons is when people try to put too many AND Nodons, and then it makes your code not clear. But in itself, it's such a generically useful operation that it's just easy A tier. For the same reason, not Nodon, also easy A tier. You could make an argument for S tier, but I feel like how frequently he's used, probably just A tier. Not Nodon is just really useful to invert a logical signal. Flag Nodon is definitely a B tier Nodon. So he stores a Boolean, which is really useful when you store a Boolean. It's not something you do all the time, but you do it pretty frequently to basically like store that an event has happened so you can just keep progress in a level. Counter Nodon, it's difficult between A and B tier, but probably an A tier. People do a lot of garbage setups to like store a variable in counter and kind of use counter as a variable that you assign. And using him as a variable isn't really the best way to use him. Normally, it's more like as an actual counter, which is that it's something that really does increment and move around. Just based on that, that would be B tier material. But what pushes him into A tier is that he's basically an integral operator, as in like integration as in calculus. He adds up whatever you've been doing cumulatively, which is actually really useful when you work with like sliders and hinges. Like let's say that you have a stick input and you need that stick input to go into like a hinge or a slider, and you need to kind of like accumulate however much input you've had to move an object around smoothly. A counter Nodon is kind of like the way to make that happen, and also is the way to keep track on like a cycle. So if you have like a marker Nodon or a circular orbit, or you're moving an object back and forth, all of these setups are going to probably use a counter Nodon to kind of like keep your spot in the loop and kind of increment you around. So I don't really have qualms putting him into A tier. RNG Nodon, how I love you RNG Nodon, but you're probably in D tier. There's just not that many times where you really want to randomize something. A lot of people might say, oh, this is kind of a low placement, but I think that you have to always be really careful with RNG to the point where it's like a beast that you need to control well, and as a result, there's not like a huge number of cases where you really want to use RNG Nodon. RNG Nodon is not something that you really want to spam, as opposed to like a couple of times where he winds up pulling a lot of weight. Timer Nodon, A tier. When you need to time an event relative to another event, he's your go-to option. Since we have the bullseye Nodon here, I'm going to pull up all the markers at once because they all go together. So 1D marker and 2D marker are definitely in B tier. And the main reason is that each of them as a switch statement will save you something like 5 to 40 Nodons each. Like I've even had people tell me like, oh, I saved like 80 Nodons using a marker. They're very useful for that, but it's not something that you really spam in your code. It's more like there's a couple of times in a level where they'll appear, and it's in almost every type of level that you'll ever make. But it's not something that appears super frequently in those levels, because each of them is like a switch statement that's like kind of like a complex logical gate. I made a whole video on how to use them, and the main thing is that you might use them like 1 to 4 times in a level, just because the 1 to 4 times you use them, they have like a huge power. Like you're doing a whole power-up system or a whole checkpoint system or an animation cycle all in one Nodon. But how many of those do you really have in a level? Usually it's like 1 to 4 times. And so that's why I'm putting them into B tier. Similarly, Bullseye goes right with them because, I mean, they are literally made to go together. Continuous Marker Display goes a tier below, and let's go C tier, because you use them in kind of a similar situation, but most of the time, a continuous marker will be going with a 2D marker. The difference is that usually you'll be pairing it with a bullseye instead of a continuous marker. It just doesn't come up as frequently where you'll want to use a continuous marker Nodon. Here we have the wormhole Nodons. So what can I say? You really don't want to spam these in your level. but they definitely do have value. So they're really generically useful in almost any type of level. You usually get a lot of value out of having like 1 to 3 different types of wormholes in a level, but if you start getting too many wormholes, it has the opposite effect of it turning your code into something that's really hard to read. The fact that they're generically useful in most levels, I'm just going to put them both together in C tier. Just because you definitely want to use them, but you also definitely don't want to use them too much. If these tiers currently look unbalanced to you, yeah, I mean, that makes sense. They're not all nodons are going to be equal. I'm not trying to make the tiers equal size. That's okay. Comment nodons don't actually do anything in your code, so they're easy F tier, except they're basically priceless. JK. If you've been watching my channel, you know, just from the beginning of the video, when you saw that tier at the top, like, you knew that that tier was specifically made because of the comment nodon. So I made a whole video on this, right? Like, when I was making this tier list, I was thinking, well, S tier versus A tier, like, because like they don't really like have an effect on your code, but they make it easy for you to read. And I got a lot of comments last time from programmers saying, well, you don't need to comment your code if you write self-documenting code, which is correct in a way. For traditional programming languages, there's an idea called self-documenting code, where you write code that's so clear and so obvious that you don't need to comment it. However, this requires a lot of tools that you don't have in GBG. In GBG, you can't give useful function names, you can't name your variables, and no, one-letter wormhole IDs don't really count. Like, that's really not good enough. And you don't get a doc string, which is the equivalent of a giant comment at the start that tells you what the whole program is about. Because you don't have any of these tools in GBG, you basically need comment nodons in order to understand your code. You could make the argument that text nodons can do a similar role, but let's be real here, like, we're putting the idea of commenting your code up in priceless tier. The main reason he's in priceless tier is because, like, how do you even compare him to other nodons, right? Like, he doesn't have a function on what your code does, but like, you need to use him. In almost every sort of level you make, you almost, like, you're guaranteed to use a comment nodon. Easy priceless tier. Similarly, a sound effect nodon, like, how do you, like, put a value on sound, all right? Like, it sucks to play a game that is just completely quiet all the time. And you can use sound effect nodon to make your own background music, but it's easy to just have some stock background music for 2 nodons, you know, a constant nodon to feed it and background music going to play, and that's all you need. The main reason I'm putting in the priceless tier is because how do you even put like a value to the idea of putting music and sound in your level? You can't. Vibrator nodon, gives a nice flair, but this is a tough choice. This is a tough choice. I'm gonna say D tier just because you don't use him super frequently. When you do use him, he's pretty good, but he's like not super generically useful in like everything you do because you don't always want to like sprinkle in rumble. Reduce gravity. You don't always want to reduce gravity, but when you do, it's really handy. Slow time, same reason. It's really useful to use slow down time nodon to debug your code and like see things happening in slow motion. And people have also done time shift levels or whatever. But in general, like, he's not like top drawer material. He's not something that you really like rush to go get. Another thing about it, reduce gravity, maybe in C tier. I don't know, this is tough. We'll pretend there's a high D tier for him to be in. Retry nodon, you need to have one in your level. I don't know what else to tell you. Retry nodon is an easy A tier because like you need to end your level sometime and also restart the level in certain dead states where the level is no longer beatable or whatever. And retry nodon is just the best way to just try again. He's not an S tier because swap game nodon is going to join him in A tier. They have a very similar role. The main difference is, do you want to restart your level from scratch, like fresh, or do you want to keep a little bit of information with you? But those two are super useful. If anything, maybe B tier, because like swap game nodon, like you'd only really use him with like a checkpoint system or like a high score system, which isn't quite as useful, but still very generically handy. Endgame nodon is an easy F tier. You never want to use this thing, like seriously. In every scenario where you want to end the level because the level is over, you want to use a retry nodon or a swap game nodon. Because usually when a player beats the level, they might either want to, you know, try something out again or look at the code to be like, oh cool, how'd that happen? And in both those situations, an endgame nodon forces you to go through extra effort to go back in. And if anything, kind of like pushes your player away from your level, like go away, which is the opposite goal. Endgame nodon, however, does have one very good use case, which is to troll the player by spontaneously ending the level and kicking them out to the main menu with no warning whatsoever, which can be hilarious, but definitely not good level design. Puzzle Clear Nodon, I mean, if we had Puzzle Clear Nodon, he would be an F tier. He does basically the exact same thing. He just ends a level in campaign mode and kicks you out to the main level select menu. Person Nodon is an A tier. He's not an S tier because his controls aren't like amazing. Like, he's no Super Mario, but he's pretty complete. He has jump physics, he has movement physics, he has all sorts of different things defined for him that you don't need to kind of put in the effort to make your whole physics engine to make him work. So he's a very good low effort option to have a character that moves around your level. Again, the main thing stopping him from being an S tier is that his controls are a little bit janky. Like, he doesn't control quite as nicely as Super Mario. Car is most certainly in C tier because jank. Like, just controlling the car, like, it can be rough. You can definitely make a car work, but you have to really, like, put effort into making it work. UFO is pretty similar, but I just find that Person is used a lot more frequently. UFO is good for making some custom characters too, but he's just not as generically useful as a Person Nodon is. And a lot of times when you're working with a custom character, you can just get away with not using a UFO and using a free hinge to an anchor point instead. Object Nodon is S tier. Like, you literally can't build a game without him. I mean, technically you can use fancy objects and moving blocks, but like, let's be real here. He's S tier. Fancy objects are definitely an A tier. They're basically objects, the main difference being that they're more unique, they can have a certain look to them, and you can tie them to certain sensors in order to make it so that a certain type of sensor reacts to a very specific type of fancy object. This basically lets you have game logic that is tied to specific items, as opposed to it has to work with all the blocks in your level or all the cylinders in your level. Moving objects, it's pretty tough to decide between S and A tier. Probably A tier. You can basically make whatever custom character you want with a moving object. You can make obstacles with him. He's very generically useful. He just requires a little bit more effort, but you can basically do whatever. Actually, you know what? I just talked myself into giving him S tier. Go get him, champ. It's just great whenever you need something to move around and you need to like define a speed or acceleration. Rotating object does not join him in S tier. It's definitely B tier. He's very similar to moving object, where you're defining a rotational speed instead of a linear speed or linear acceleration, but there's just not that many times where you want to give something an angular velocity. I would even like go a step lower and put him in C tier. He's just not that generically useful in like every setup that you want to make. Extendables. So extendables are unique in that they're like the only objects that have no mass, so they won't screw with your character's physics, but at the same time, they're also not solid, which kind of limits how well you can use them. They're basically good for like HUDs and related bars, or in general when you just want like a massless object that's connected to a character without changing the physics. The fact that you can't put a texture to it also really limits its versatility. You know, let's even put it in D tier. Like, sometimes you want to use an extendable object for a HUD or like a health bar or whatever, but it's not something you really want to use a lot of. Effect Nodon. What can I say? I mean, he's priceless. Like, it's a similar concept with like sound, right? Like, how do you put a value on like flashy effects in a level, right? The idea of, you know, having some extra oomph and feedback and like, you know, popping effects, etc. Like, how do you put a price on that? Like, literally priceless. Text Nodon. Text Nodon is amazing for giving instructions, which is very useful in a wide variety of levels, or for having like a score or like time or whatever. Like, you basically like write as part of a HUD or like an element in a level that kind of tells you what a number is. Definitely A tier material. Number Nodon. Number Nodon is amazing for debugging, and also for just showing you like a score or like what's your progress in a level or like a timer. These might not be as generically useful. The combination of like debugging and also putting numbers in your level is like, well, I'm going to put them like an A tier instead of B tier. Textures. I mean, you don't really need a texture in your level, but it's art. So like, literally, like, how do you put a price on that? Like, how do you even say like, well, technically you don't need art, but let's be real here. Like, the game would be like a lot less fun to play if you didn't have textures, if you couldn't make animations, if you couldn't draw words when you're out of a text box Nodon, etc. Like, there's just so many use cases for textures, functional and not. It's like the game would not be the same without him. Touch sensor is definitely the most useful sensor by a lot. Like, It just checks like, is something at that area? You use it for all sorts of different triggers, etc. Very, very useful. Destroying Nodon. This is the one that checks, is this object destroying another object or not? This one is probably in B tier because he's basically the most useful Nodon for setting up an object that has multiple hit points, which you do actually want to use very frequently. Destroyed Object Nodon. This is a more specific version of the Object Break Nodon. The difference is that this sensor goes on one very specific object. Now, this is really generically useful. I'm probably gonna put him in B tier just because it's really handy. Grab sensor. This sensor, you'd imagine I put him right next to hand because, I mean, why wouldn't you use him with a hand? The answer is because there's not actually that many times where you are using a hand and you actually want a grab sensor. It's just not as useful a combination as you'd imagine. When you're using a hand, you normally just define, here's everything you're allowed to grab, and there's everything you're not allowed to grab. And you just let it play out. So I'm gonna put the grab sensor in D tier, maybe in C tier, but definitely not as high as B tier. Location sensor. Location sensor right next to touch sensor. If you need to do like any sort of AI, any sort of like check if the player has fallen a certain distance or more to like restart the level, if you just need to check where something is, if you need to use touch controls and just check if something's close, there's just so many different use cases. He's very similar to a touch sensor. The main difference is that you're using a location sensor when you are doing the math yourself. And there's just a lot of situations where that comes up in a game. Speed sensor. You'd imagine him to be not that useful, but actually, like, whenever you're making a custom character, there's a lot of situations where you want to define like a max speed or take that character's speed in a certain direction and remove it so that the character flows more smoothly. So because he's really useful for custom characters and also like sometimes in AI, I'm putting him in C tier. Maybe he earns B tier. Acceleration Nodon is definitely not as good. He is definitely like a tier below speed just because he's just not as useful. There's just not that many times where you want to know something's acceleration as when you want to know its speed. I've used acceleration before once for like one version of an AI to check for gravity, but there's not a whole lot of use cases for this. You can use him for like a custom character, but he's not like that handy. Angle sensor is most certainly C tier because you basically use angle sensor when you're making either an AI that faces a certain direction or when you have a custom character that you need to like turn a certain part of him depending on what angle he's currently at, or you're detecting on other things that kind of depend on how an object has been rotated in order to rotate something else to kind of like line up with it. Because those sort of situations like just aren't super ridiculously common, I'm gonna put it in C tier. Rotation speed sensor. Oh man. How frequently do you really use this guy? Like, I'm gonna not put him in F tier just because it's not like I don't want you to like actively not use him, but he's definitely like one of the least useful Nodons out there. There's just not a lot of times where you want to respond to something turning, although you might be able to find some use for this, again, in custom characters. Very similar to an acceleration Nodon. One-dimensional slider Nodon. You're really useful. I'll use you all the time to like move things back and forth. Like in general, whenever you need something that moves along a straight line, which is really frequently, like whenever you need an enemy that just kind of goes back and forth, or an obstacle that goes back and forth, or you need to move an object and not let it move in the other two axes, he's really handy. Free slider, you might imagine is not as useful, but he's literally S tier. Easy, like, I have no doubt in my mind. You use him all the time. Whenever you have a character that you don't want to move in one axis, but you do want him to be able to move in like 2D, you will use this free slider. This can be for an enemy, this can be for a custom character, this can be for like whatever. Or you just want to define coordinates. So you want to send a block to a certain XYZ coordinate relative to something else. Free slider lets you do that. Free slider is just so core to how so many parts of a level work, and just setting up obstacles and characters in general, like I can't give him anything less than S tier. He does so much work. In 2D levels, he helps you stay in 2D. In 3D levels, he lets you quantify coordinates really accurately and just send things places, and he just does everything. Like whenever you need to put something in a certain position, he's your guy. I can't do anything better to sell him than this. Hinge Nodon. S or A. I mean, so hinge is like really useful for like rotating object. Like anytime you have something that rotates, which actually is like really useful whenever you need something that like faces a certain direction, like a turret or an enemy or a player character or a seesaw or like whatever, like super, super useful. There's basically no other way to like define angles. So,
oh man, this is tough. This is really tough. This is really tough.
But like, since I'm on the fence on this, like I feel like I want to put him in A tier because I feel like S tier should only be the things that are like super obvious, like so obviously like above the rest. Now here's the last connector, string nodon. He is not that useful. He goes in D tier. He has physics associated with him, which is really cool when you want like a rope. But a lot of times, like I just want like a leash that kind of like puts two things like a certain distance, maximum distance away from each other. And string nodon doesn't actually do that because he actually is like a rope with physics. Even if you set the stiffness all the way down, it's not the same. There's just not that many times where you really want to use a string nodon. Launcher. So launcher is in B tier, all right? There's two main reasons that you want to use them. Either one is for projectiles, a player throwing fireballs, or an enemy shooting bullets. But there's also another situation that's really useful where he is the only nodon that will spawn new objects in the game. The only one. So when you need that sort of situation to happen, that's like the only option. Granted, that situation isn't like super ridiculously common, but the combination of enemy projectiles, player projectiles, and whenever you want to spawn in items, that combination is just so useful. I'm putting him in B tier. Destroy object nodon. There's a lot of times where you just want to destroy an object on a trigger. It's not like, you know, you can't put him next to a slider. Like that would be not fair to the slider. That's definitely B tier material. The reason why destroy object nodon is really useful is because it's for when you want to like break objects on a trigger. Like a certain event happens in the level, and this can be something like, for example, an enemy runs out of hit points, or you hit a switch and now you need to break open a door or whatever, and you need that trigger to actually break the item. Destroy object nodon is your girl, but yeah, that just happens really frequently. Teleporter. It's really useful to teleport objects around. The better you get at the game, the fewer teleporters you use. So if I were like at the start of the game, like I would probably put teleporters in like A tier. But the more we learn about how to like move things around and use like swap game nodon and other sort of tools available to us, I'm feeling more B tier. Again, it's really useful to just like move something somewhere else or reset an object's momentum. It's just not something that you want to spam. Normally teleporter spam is a bad sign. Normally that means you want to use one teleporter on like a trigger. But that said, teleporters are really good for kind of checkpointing setups where you can just kind of teleport the player back to the start or teleport the player to a checkpoint whenever they're ready to advance in the level. So I think that putting a teleporter in the same tier as a swap game nodon makes complete sense. And a teleport exit obviously needs to be its buddy. There are other situations where you want to use teleporters to kind of like move around, but the number one most common situation is when you need to send the player or an object back to its starting position or over to a checkpoint. Attract object. I love the idea of an attract object. I would easily put it in B tier, except it's so weak. It's like the attraction that you get, like the force is just not very strong. It's not there. If the force were to go much higher, I would easily put this in B tier, but it's so weak that really limits how many different ways you can use the attract nodon, because it can't like, you can't make like a super powerful magnet that'll just like suck anything in. And that force just requires some distance. It requires its time to actually apply and accelerate the object in whatever direction. The attract object has like a couple things going for it. Like you can attach it to things and you can set attract versus repel, but those aren't really enough to pull it up out of D tier in my opinion. It's just like, it's too weak. The force is just too weak. World nodon. I mean, he changes the size of the world. I mean, I feel like you wouldn't really argue if I put him in the priceless category. It's kind of like picking a different theme in Mario Maker, or, you know, changing a different shape, different size or whatever of the world. Like, how do you put a price to that? In terms of usefulness, you will basically always use exactly one of him in your level. Like almost guaranteed, you're gonna use one of them in your level. But the idea of how useful he is just like, how do you quantify that? Like, you need to change the space. You need to have like a certain set of dimensions for your level. Like, that's it. That's all I have to say. Like, you can't put a price on it. Now let's get to the camera nodons. Game screen nodon. Easy S tier. Like, what are you gonna do if you want a 2D level, right? And sometimes even with a 3D level. All right, he's not an S tier because he's the only option for 2D levels. You can use the other cameras for 2D levels. You have plenty of other options. He's just the best. He's super easy to program. You can slap him on a character. You can use auto scroll or whatever. Like, super easy. Like, just He's just great. For the same reason, camera Nodon also will take a spot in S tier. Because, like, what are you gonna do in, like, how do you plan to make a 3D level without camera Nodon? Probably not. He's just like, it's super easy to just set up a camera Nodon, attach the camera Nodon to your player, and put sticks to control the angle. You can use an advanced camera, sure, and that's definitely an option. But he's so easy to use, so low effort to use, and carries so much weight for 3D levels. Just based on how you use him for 3D levels is like easy S tier. Like I don't have a single doubt in my mind. S tier. Now we have the advanced camera. I know some of you may not be familiar with the advanced camera, but I'm gonna like talk a little bit through them. Camera target defines where your camera is pointed at. If you are using an advanced camera, it's pretty handy, but you don't use advanced camera that much. Within the advanced camera, I'd probably put him in... I'm gonna put him in C tier just because advanced camera in general isn't super generically useful. Camera position Nodon, you basically like, you want to use them together. Camera direction, I'm gonna say that he's in a lower tier, in D. Like you can use him for like first person stuff and related to like move an angle around, but when you're using an advanced camera, it's more likely than not going to be with a camera target Nodon. And when you use a camera target Nodon, it can be kind of weird to also use a camera direction Nodon. That combination is just going to be very rare. So within the rare category of you're using an advanced camera, it's even more rare to use a camera direction Nodon. Field of view. If you ever use field of view, it basically like is how wide your camera angle is, which is like a basic setting. You don't really need to change that setting very often, which is why like I'm kind of like fluctuating between these two. Because a lot of times when you use an advanced camera, like the original starting angle is really good enough, so you don't actually need to use a field of view camera Nodon. So head Nodon. Well, with head Nodon, I went between, I really hate him because he's so janky and like how you can connect things to him, to being like, oh cool, we can make HUDs, but the HUDs that you make are really janky. And it's like, I keep going back and forth, and you can use them for like first person, etc. But man, this is tough because like, it's a combination of he's hard to use, and you don't want to use him all the time. I'm maybe gonna put him in B. So here's the thing, you can also use a head Nodon, not just to set up a HUD, you can also use him to set up a thumbnail for your level. And the fact that you can use him to like easily set up a thumbnail for your level, like wherever in your code, is why I'm thinking about B tier, but you know, probably C tier. I'm on the fence about this one. It's like, it's tough. It's a tough call, so I'm just gonna have to make the executive decision to call him C tier. While we finish the first pass of this tier list, I think it's a good time now to go back, have a couple of tune-ups here or there, because now we have a much clearer image of how useful something needs to be in each individual tier. I'm going to downgrade if touched from C tier to D tier to be with touch position, just because when working with touch controls, you're really gonna be like, you don't just dabble in one or the other, like you really are going to be using both of them together. Rethinking my tier list makes me feel more guilty about putting Stick into A tier, but I'm still going to put him in A tier. IR motion camera, now that I think about it, he is really hard to use. So, I mean, he's way better than IR emitter, but like, you don't get a lot of situations to use him just because it's really hard to use him without like a full labo setup. So I'm downgrading him to D tier. With this, I'm kind of content with the final result, so I'm proud to call this the official tier list for GBG. There you go, that's the complete tier list. I mean, you can feel free to disagree. This should give you my general opinion on how useful I think different Nodons are. If you skipped this part of the video, well, I guess you missed the whole ride, but I hope you enjoyed anyway. Do you agree with my tier list? You should, but you probably don't. Let me know what you think. Let me know which things should actually be S tier, or whatever. I'm not too worried about spaghetti apologists, because I don't think they can figure out how to comment on my video, seeing as they don't comment their own code either. Just remember that if your argument is plus or minus one tier, I'm not really going to acknowledge that. It's like, plus or minus one tier, who cares? Anyway, if you like GBG tutorials or related, you know, other fun stuff on this channel, feel free to subscribe, and I'll see you around later. Bye!